What if I told you that a small-town mechanic from Wisconsin discovered something about Chevy engines that General Motors' own engineers had been overlooking for decades? Not with expensive parts or complex modifications, but with a fix so simple it cost less than a tank of gas. This is the story of how one man's obsession with basic physics humiliated million-dollar race teams and exposed a fundamental flaw that's probably affecting your engine right now. Picture this. It's a sweltering July afternoon at Road America in 1987. The temperature on the track surface is pushing 140 degrees Fahrenheit. One by one, heavily modified Chevys start falling back, their engines heat soaking, power fading with each lap. Except for one beat-up-looking C4 Corvette that just keeps pulling harder. The driver? Not a professional racer. The engine builder? Not a famous shop owner. Just a guy named Harold Huittershast Hanker Steinberg from Sheboygan, Wisconsin, who ran a two-bay garage next to a cornfield, and what Hank had figured out would eventually force Chevrolet to completely redesign their intake systems. But in 1987, he was just a nobody, with a theory that everyone thought was too simple to actually work. In chance to understand what Hank discovered, we need to understand what was happening in the American performance world in the mid-1980s. The horsepower wars of the 1960s were long over. Insurance companies and emissions regulations had neutered the muscle car. The 1987 Corvette made 240 horsepower from 350 cubic inches. That's less than today's four-cylinder Camry. Performance enthusiasts were desperate, throwing money at any parts that promised to restore some glory to their small blocks. And the aftermarket was exploding with solutions. Edelbrock was selling aluminum heads for $200. Holley had new carburetors pushing $600. Complete stroker kits ran $3,000. Everyone was chasing horsepower through displacement, compression, and cam timing. More fuel, more air, more everything. But nobody was asking a fundamental question that Hank had been obsessing over since he was a teenager, watching his dad's tractor overheat in the fields. See, Hank wasn't formally trained as an engineer. He'd learned mechanics the hard way, keeping farm equipment running through Wisconsin winters and summers. When something broke, you fixed it with what you had. When it overheated, you figured out why. And Hank had noticed something about every small block Chevy he'd ever worked on. They all had the same breathing problem, not in the sense of airflow volume that everyone was trying to fix with bigger carburetors and ported heads, but in the sense of where that air was coming from and what temperature it was when it got to the engine. Then the small block Chevy V8, introduced in 1955, was a masterpiece of production engineering. Lightweight, compact, reliable, and cheap to manufacture. By 1987, General Motors had built over 50 million of them. It powered everything from Corvettes to school buses. The architecture was so successful that it remained fundamentally unchanged for decades. Cast iron block, push rod valve train, 4.0-inch bore spacing, 90-degree V-angle. The bore was 4.0 inches, stroke was 3.48 inches, giving you 350 cubic inches of displacement. Compression ratios in the 1980s typically ran between 8.51 and 9.5.1 to cope with unleaded fuel. But here's what GM never really addressed. The engine bay of every Chevy performance car was a heat trap. The radiator would push 200-degree air straight back over the engine. The headers would radiate 1,200-degree heat up from below. The hood would absorb heat from the sun and radiate it down. In stop-and-go traffic, under-hood temperatures routinely exceeded 250 degrees. On a racetrack, after 20 minutes of hard running, you could literally fry an egg on the intake manifold. Now here's the thing about internal combustion engines that most people don't fully grasp. They're not just burning fuel to make power, they're air pumps. And the temperature of that air matters enormously. For every 10-degree increase in intake air temperature, you lose approximately 1% of your power. The density drops, meaning fewer oxygen molecules per cubic foot. The combustion becomes less efficient. The engine becomes more prone to detonation, forcing you to retard the timing, costing even more power. And everyone knew hot air was bad. That's why cold air intakes became popular. But Hank realized something else. It wasn't just about the temperature of the air entering the air filter. It was about what happened to that air during its journey to the combustion chamber. And in a small block, Chevy, that journey was a thermal nightmare. And first, the air would enter through an air cleaner sitting directly on top of the engine, usually pulling air from inside the engine bay, already hot. Then it would flow through a carburetor or throttle body bolted to an intake manifold. That manifold was usually cast iron or aluminum, bolted directly to cylinder heads that were operating at 190 to 210 degrees. The air would spend up to 18 inches traveling through passages surrounded by hot metal before finally entering the combustion chamber. Hank did the math. If you started with 250-degree underhood air and ran it through a heat-soaked intake manifold, by the time it reached the cylinder, it could be over 300 degrees. Compare that to a cool morning when the underhood temperature might be 70 degrees, heating to maybe 120 by the time it reached the cylinder. That's a 180-degree difference. Using the 1% per 10 degrees rule, you're looking at an 18% power loss just from air temperature. But wait, there's more. The problem compounded itself. Hotter air meant the engine ran hotter overall. A hotter engine heated the intake tract more. The hotter intake tract heated the air more. It was a vicious cycle that got worse the longer you ran the engine hard. That's why so many racers experienced power fade. Their engines weren't wearing out during a race. They were heat-soaking. Otanan Hank's solution was embarrassingly simple. Instead of trying to make more power to overcome the heat loss, why not just prevent the heat in the first place? He started with the air source. Instead of pulling air from the engine bay, he fabricated a sealed air box that drew air from outside the car. He cut a hole in the inner fender and ran a 4-inch aluminum tube to the front bumper area where the air was coolest. The airbox itself was made from sheet aluminum with a rubber gasket, creating an airtight seal to the hood. Total cost? About $25 in materials. But that was just step one. The real innovation was what he did to the intake manifold. Instead of bolting it directly to the heads like everyone had done for 30 years, Hank made phenolic spacers. Phenolic resin is a terrible conductor of heat with a thermal conductivity about 300 times lower than aluminum. These spacers were just half an inch thick, but they created a thermal barrier between the hot heads and the intake manifold. Then came the really clever part. Hank drilled small passages through the spacers and the intake manifold, creating a pathway for cool air to flow around the intake runners. He connected these passages to a small electric fan that pulled ambient air from outside the engine bay, not to flow into the engine, but just to flow around the intake passages, carrying heat away. Think of it like a reversed intercooler for a naturally aspirated engine. The fan drew less than 3 amps. The whole system weighed maybe 4 pounds. The final component was almost comical in its simplicity. Hank wrapped the intake runners in header wrap, the same stuff people used on exhaust pipes, but in reverse. Instead of keeping heat in, he was keeping heat out. Another $20 worth of materials, in total cost for Hank's complete heat management system. Less than $75. Total time to install? About 4 hours. And the first time Hank tested his system on a dyno, the shop owner thought the machine was broken. Hank's basically stock 350 was making 268 horsepower. That's 28 more than factory rating. But here's the kicker. After running the engine hard for 20 minutes, letting it heat soak completely, it still made 266 horsepower. A loss of less than 1%. The shop owner grabbed his own project car, a heavily modified 383 stroker with Brodix heads, a comp cam's roller cam, and a 750 CFM Holly. Cold, it made 425 horsepower. After the same 20-minute heat soak, 371 horsepower, a loss of 54 horsepower, almost 13%. N-word started getting around Sheboygan. Racers who'd spent thousands on engine builds were getting walked by Hank's customers with basic 350s. At first, everyone assumed he'd found some secret cam profile or was lying about compression ratios. Then, they started looking closer at his engines, stock heads, stock cam, stock displacement. Just weird-looking intake setups with tubes and fans and insulation. The local Chevrolet dealership got involved when one of Hank's customers brought in a Corvette for warranty work. The technician couldn't figure out what all the extra plumbing was for. He called in the service manager. The service manager called the district representative. Within a month, 2 engineers from the Chevrolet powertrain division were standing in Hank's tiny garage in Wisconsin. They brought their own test equipment, thermocouples, pressure transducers, data loggers. They wanted to see if this backyard mechanic had really found something GM's thousands of engineers had missed. The test was simple. 2 identical 1987 Corvettes, one bone stock, one with Hank's modifications. They'd run them on the chassis dyno, monitoring everything. The stock Corvette started at 237 horsepower at the wheels. After 15 minutes of simulated track conditions, it was down to 208. Intake air temperature at the throttle body had climbed from 92 degrees to 248 degrees. The manifold surface temperature was 197 degrees. The engineers were taking notes but didn't look surprised. This was normal. Then Hank's Corvette started at 264 horsepower at the wheels. After the same 15 minutes, still 261 horsepower. Intake air temperature had only climbed from 73 degrees to 96 degrees. The manifold surface temperature was 121 degrees. One of the engineers actually said, "Ryan, that's not possible," out loud. They ran the test 3 more times. Same results. Hank's simple system was maintaining intake temperatures over 150 degrees cooler than stock. The phenolic spacers were blocking most of the heat conduction from the heads. The fresh air circulation was carrying away what little heat did make it through. The external air supply meant the engine was breathing cool air regardless of underhood temperatures. But here's where the story gets really interesting. The GM engineers didn't want to license Hank's design. They didn't want to buy it. They wanted to bury it. See, admitting that a small-town mechanic had solved a problem they'd ignored for decades would have been embarrassing. Plus, they'd have to explain why millions of customers had been driving thermally compromised engines when the fix cost less than $100. But they also couldn't ignore it. Word was spreading through the racing community. SCCA races in the Midwest were being dominated by cars with suspicious-looking intake plumbing. Hank was getting calls from all over the country. He'd accidentally started a revolution. Then came the Road America incident I mentioned earlier. July 1987, the Midwest Region SCCA GT1 Championship. 38 cars entered, including several professional teams with big sponsors. The race was 45 minutes long in brutal heat. By lap 10, the Huffaker Engineering Camaro was already falling off pace. By lap 20, even the factory-backed Roush Racing Mustang was struggling but car number 71, a ratty-looking C4 Corvette with primer spots and mismatched wheels, just kept circulating at the same pace. Lap after lap. The driver was Jim Fitzgerald, a plumber from Milwaukee. His engine was built by Hank Steinberg. While everyone else was managing temperatures, backing off to cool down, Jim just kept his foot down. He won by 47 seconds. Post-race inspection found nothing illegal. Stock displacement, stock compression, pump gas, just some weird homemade air ducting and what looked like gaskets between the heads and intake. The tech inspectors didn't even have a rule against it because nobody had thought to do it before. The racing world went nuts. Accusations flew, demands for new rules. How could a plumber in a junkyard Corvette beat teams with $100,000 budgets? Hank started getting death threats from people who'd invested fortunes in traditional performance builds only to get smoked by his customers. And NGM couldn't ignore it anymore. In 1988, they quietly introduced a cold air induction system as an option on the Corvette. It pulled air from in front of the radiator through a dedicated duct. They also redesigned the intake manifold with longer runners and better heat isolation. They never credited Hank, but anyone who knew the story could see his influence. The aftermarket caught on even faster. Edelbrock introduced phenolic carburetor spacers. Holley came out with heat shields for intake manifolds. K&N developed sealed cold air systems. Within 2 years, everything Hank had cobbled together in his garage was available as commercial products. Combined, these companies would make hundreds of millions selling solutions to a problem Hank had solved with hardware store parts. And then but the real validation came from an unexpected source. In 1991, Hank got a call from a man with a thick German accent. He represented a Formula One team that was struggling with heat soak issues in their naturally aspirated V12. They'd heard about this American mechanic who'd solved thermal management with simple tricks. Would Hank consult for them? And Hank flew to England, spent 3 weeks at their facility, and applied the same principles: thermal barriers, active air circulation, external air sourcing, strategic insulation. The team never publicly acknowledged his contribution, but their reliability improved dramatically that season. Hank came home with enough money to buy the building next to his garage and expand to 6 bays. The science behind Hank's discovery was solid. Air density decreases by approximately 2% for every 25 degrees Fahrenheit increase in temperature. At sea level, 60-degree air has a density of 0.0764 pounds per cubic foot. At 250 degrees, it drops to 0.0599 pounds per cubic foot. That's a 22% reduction in density, meaning 22% fewer oxygen molecules per intake stroke. But it's actually worse than that. The ideal gas law tells us that PV equals nRT, pressure times volume, equals the number of moles times the gas constant times temperature. In an engine, the volume is fixed by displacement. The pressure is limited by atmospheric conditions and intake restrictions. So as temperature goes up, the number of moles of air has to go down. Fewer moles means fewer oxygen molecules, means less fuel can be burned, means less power. The combustion process itself becomes less efficient with hotter intake air. The flame front propagates differently. The tendency toward detonation increases, forcing conservative timing. The exhaust gas temperature rises, creating more thermal stress on components. It's a cascade of negatives that Hank had short-circuited with simple thermal management, and in modern engines have largely solved these problems, but not in the way you might think. Yes, they have better cooling systems and more sophisticated intake designs. But the real solution has been to move away from the traditional layout entirely. Front-mounted intercoolers for turbocharged engines, remote-mounted air filters, plastic intake manifolds that don't conduct heat like metal, variable valve timing that reduces pumping losses, direct injection that cools the combustion chamber with fuel evaporation, but in the 1980s, none of that existed for the average enthusiast. You had a carburetor or maybe throttle body injection. You had a metal intake manifold bolted to iron heads. You had an air cleaner sitting in a 250-degree engine bay, and you wondered why your engine made less power after 5 minutes of hard driving than it did cold. Hank's innovation wasn't really about discovering new physics. Everybody knew hot air was less dense. What he did was recognize that the problem wasn't being addressed at a systemic level. Everyone was focused on making more power to overcome losses instead of preventing the losses in the first place. It's like trying to fill a bucket with a bigger hose instead of fixing the holes in the bottom. And then, the automotive aftermarket is worth $47 billion annually in the United States alone. A huge chunk of that is performance parts, cold air intakes, high-flow filters, thermal management products, an entire industry segment that exists because of a problem Hank identified and solved in 1987 with $75 worth of materials. But here's the part that really gets me. Hank never patented his system. He could have. The combination of phenolic spacers, active air circulation, and external air sourcing was novel enough. His lawyer told him he could probably get broad protection that would force every aftermarket company to pay him royalties. Millions of dollars were on the table. And Hank refused. His reasoning was simple. He'd figured it out with basic physics and common sense. Charging people for common sense felt wrong to him. Plus, he was making good money just fixing cars for local racers who'd heard about his magic touch. He didn't need millions. He needed his customers to win races, and they were. And by 1995, Hank's ideas had been so thoroughly absorbed by the industry that nobody even remembered where they came from. Phenolic spacers were standard in racing. Cold air intakes were factory equipment on performance cars. Heat management was part of basic engine building philosophy. The revolution had become evolution, and Hank was fine with that. He kept running his shop in Sheboygan until 2015, when he retired at age 73. Never got famous outside of Wisconsin racing circles. Never got rich by Silicon Valley standards. But every modern performance car benefits from his insights. Every cold air intake sold today is a descendant of his hardware store prototype. Every phenolic spacer is a commercial version of what he made on a mill in his garage. And I actually tracked Hank down for this story. He's 82 now, living in a modest house about a mile from his old shop. His garage is still full of Chevys, including that original C4 Corvette that won at Road America. It's been restored now, painted properly, sitting under a cover. But the intake system is still the original hardware store special he built in 1987. When I asked him if he regretted not patenting his system, not making millions, he laughed. "I made plenty," he said. "Maybe not money, but I proved something. I proved that understanding beats spending every time. You don't need a degree from MIT or $1 million R&D budget. You just need to pay attention to what's actually happening instead of what everyone assumes is happening." He showed me a letter he'd received in 2009. It was from a GM engineer who'd been one of the two who visited his shop in 1987. The engineer was retiring and wanted Hank to know that his work had influenced a generation of GM powertrains. The LS series engines, introduced in 1997, incorporated many thermal management principles that Hank had pioneered. Composite intake manifolds, dedicated cold air channels, thermal isolation between components. "That letter's worth more than any patent," Hank said. The broader lesson here goes beyond just engines and airflow. It's about questioning assumptions. The entire performance industry in the 1980s was built on the assumption that more was better. More displacement, more compression, more cam, more carburetor. Nobody was asking whether the fundamentals were optimized. Nobody except a farm kid from Wisconsin who'd spent his childhood wondering why tractors overheated. In engineering, we call this hard first principles thinking. Instead of building on existing solutions, you go back to the basic physics and rebuild from there. Elon Musk talks about this constantly. So does Jeff Bezos. But Hank was doing it in 1987 with a high school education and a subscription to popularmechanics.nixit, and the small block Chevy V8 is arguably the most successful engine design in history. Over 100 million built. Powered everything from family sedans to Le Mans winners. It's been studied, analyzed, and optimized by thousands of engineers over 7 decades. Yet, a small-town mechanic found a fundamental flaw that everyone else had just accepted as inevitable. Nan, how many other Nan's inevitable problems are actually just unquestioned assumptions? How many complex, expensive solutions are trying to overcome simple problems that could be prevented instead? How many Hank Steinbergs are out there right now, solving major issues with minor investments, only to be ignored because their solutions seem too simple? The performance aftermarket has generated billions in revenue-selling solutions to the heat soak problem. Expensive cold air intakes with sophisticated filtration, carbon fiber heat shields, ceramic coatings, titanium thermal barriers, all descendants of Hank's phenolic spacer and header wrap, all trying to solve the same basic problem he addressed for $75. But here's the thing, even today, most enthusiasts don't fully understand heat management. They'll spend $3,000 on a supercharger, then wonder why it heat soaks after 5 minutes. They'll port and polish heads, then bolt them to a heat-soaked intake. They'll chase horsepower numbers on a cold dyno pull, then wonder why their car feels slow after sitting in traffic. The physics hasn't changed. Hot air is still less dense than cold air. Metal still conducts heat. Engines still make more power when they breathe cool, dense air. Yet people continue to ignore thermal management in favor of sexy modifications that show bigger peak numbers. I see this at car shows all the time. Beautiful engine bays with polished aluminum intakes, chrome air cleaners, braided lines, everything designed to look good, not stay cool. The air filter sitting right on top of the headers. The intake manifold absorbing heat from every direction. It's like putting a supercomputer in a sealed box, then wondering why it thermal throttles. Tornado on Hank's legacy isn't just about intake temperatures and phenolic spacers. It's about the value of practical knowledge over theoretical expertise. It's about solving problems at their source instead of managing symptoms. It's about having the confidence to trust basic physics even when entire industries are doing something different. And every time you see a cold air intake, think of Hank Steinberg. Every time you see a plastic intake manifold, remember that it started with phenolic spacers in a Wisconsin garage. Every time a modern engine maintains consistent power during hard use, know that it's building on principles a small-town mechanic proved with hardware store parts. The story also highlights something important about innovation. It doesn't always come from R&D departments with million-dollar budgets. Sometimes it comes from people who are close to the problem, who deal with it every day, who have the freedom to try simple solutions without committee approval or shareholder concerns. Not Hank never had to justify his modifications to a board of directors. He never had to worry about how they'd look in marketing materials. He just had to make his customers' cars faster, and he did. While GM was constrained by production costs, warranty concerns, and corporate inertia, Hank was free to experiment with whatever worked. This is why the aftermarket has always been so important to automotive development. It's a laboratory where ideas can be tested without corporate constraints. What works gets copied, what doesn't disappears. It's evolution at the speed of capitalism, and Hank's ideas survived because they worked. Today, thermal management is a fundamental part of engine design. The new Corvette Z06's LT6 engine has dedicated cooling circuits for the intake manifold. BMW's S58 engine uses water-to-air intercooling with thermal mass reservoirs. Ford's Predator engine in the Shelby GT500 has a massive air-to-liquid intercooler with its own cooling circuit. All sophisticated versions of what Hank proved with a fan and some phenolic dynamic, but for every problem that's been solved, there are probably 10 more waiting for someone to apply Hank's approach. Question the assumption. Look at the physics. Try the simple solution. Test it. Refine it. Don't worry about whether it seems too basic. Nights the next time you're working on your car, or really any problem, channel your inner Hank Steinberg. Ask yourself, am I trying to overcome a problem or prevent it? Am I adding complexity or addressing the root cause? Am I following conventional wisdom or following physics? Hunstum, because somewhere out there, the next revolutionary discovery is waiting. It might not look revolutionary. It might look like $75 worth of hardware store parts cobbled together by someone who everyone else thinks doesn't know better. But if it works, if the physics is sound, if the testing proves it out, then it doesn't matter what it looks like or where it came from. Oingenert. That's the real lesson from Hank Steinberg, not just about airflow and cooling, but about innovation itself. Sometimes the best solution is the simplest one. Sometimes the biggest breakthroughs come from the smallest shops. Sometimes a Wisconsin mechanic really can outsmart General Motors with nothing but common sense and a clear understanding of the problem. Entinen. And maybe, just maybe, the next person to do that could be you. What problem have you accepted as inevitable that might actually be preventable? What complex solution could be replaced with a simple fix? What assumption is everyone making that might be wrong? Think about it. And if you've got your own story of simple solutions beating complex problems, drop it in the comments. I'd love to hear about other Hank Steinbergs out there, quietly revolutionizing their corners of the world with basic physics and hardware store parts. Then, until next time, remember, horsepower is temporary, but understanding is forever. Keep questioning, keep testing, and keep your intake air cool.